As you can tell by the title of today's story, we're going to tell you about one of Tennessee's and Appalachia's most famous sons. Frontiersman, soldier, politician, and American folk hero, Davy Crockett. Hello, folks. I'm Steve Gilley, along with Rod Mullins, and this is Stories, a History of Appalachia. Now, be sure to go down below, click that subscribe button, and ding the bell so you get notifications every time we have a new story out. And we'd love it if you'd give us a thumbs up. And Rod, we have hit a milestone.
Wow.
I don't know if you were aware of that. We have hit 1,000 subscribers.
It's a start.
It is a start.
So it's better than nothing. So, well, anyway, as we get ready to talk about this podcast, what else can you say about this man? At the same time, I want to just start breaking into song because this is something I learned when I was very young from watching TV on a satellite system back, I guess, when I was in my teens. But I think of some big time things with this when I hear this man's name, and I guess the one that sticks out with me is the Alamo more than anything else, and of course, politician too, but nobody else like Davy Crockett.
Absolutely not. And while most people associate him with the Alamo, he had a huge life that encompasses more than just the Alamo, and we're going to tell you about that today. Now, Davy Crockett himself was born near present-day Limestone, Tennessee, between Jonesboro and Greenville. In fact, Rod, a state historic park is located near the site of his birthplace, containing a replica of the Crockett family cabin as it would have appeared on August 17th, 1789, the day he was born. Now, the Crocketts had arrived in America in the early 1700s from Ireland. But contrary to what you may think, they were not ethnically Irish, nor were they Ulstermen. They were actually French Huguenots, or Protestants in France who'd settled in Ireland. Antoine, and I hope I say this right, Antoine de Saint-Cyr-Baronet de Crockagné was placed in the French household troops by none other than King Louis XIV.
Wow.
Antoine married a French girl, and the two immigrated to Ireland, where they dropped those three fancy-sounding names and anglicized Crocketane to plain old Crockett. Now, they had a son, Joseph Lewis, who married an Irish woman named Sarah Stewart, and the two of them emigrated to New York, and they had a son named William David Crockett. William, in turn, had a son named David, born in Pennsylvania, as the family moved south and west. And David had a son named John, who was our Davy's father. Okay. John, by the way, lived in Hawkins County and was one of the Overmountain men who fought the British at the Battle of Kings Mountain.
Funny thing here, Steve, you mentioned that about the anglicized name going to Crockett from the French. Happens to be the same thing in my family tree, going back and looking at Mullins. Yeah, there's some Mullinses that came out of France. Des Moulins is what they were called, and then it was anglicized into Mullins. So what a small world we live in. Well, Davy Crockett grew up in East Tennessee, gaining a reputation as a hunter and as a storyteller. Along the way, he moved with his family farther and farther west. For a time, the family lived in Morristown, where John Crockett had a tavern. The elder Crockett also had, at one time or another, a grist mill and a farm, and both were destroyed in a flood. He moved to Jefferson County, where he was forced into bankruptcy. It was at that bankruptcy and the need for cash that prompted John Crockett to indenture Davy to a cattle farmer named Jacob Seiler. Now, that's what we're talking about here. When we say indenture, it's sort of like a little thing of slavery is what it is, because, hate to say it, came up on my family and the family tree a little bit myself back several years ago. But anyway, he helped take care of the cattle during a trip from East Tennessee to near the Natural Bridge in Virginia, making him what would be later called a cowboy. He returned home where his father enrolled him and his brothers in school, but apparently school just did not sit well with Davy, did it, Steve?
No, it didn't. You see, he got into a fight with a fellow student, after which he cut school, which caused dear old Dad to try to whip the snot out of him.
Whoa.
Notice, Rod, I said try. For you see, Davy was a very fast young man, and try as he might, John was not able to catch him to apply a proper whipping.
Wow.
Now, Davy Crockett decided the best thing for him to do at that point was to sign up as a cowboy with another cattle drive, this time to Front Royal, Virginia. And after that, he agreed to join a wagon master on a trip to Gerardstown in what's now West Virginia. Now, Crockett didn't return home after this latest adventure. Instead, he hired him out to a farmer in Virginia, then moved to Christiansburg to apprentice with a hat maker named Elijah Griffith. Davy finally returned home to Morristown in 1802 after a 400-mile trip by foot.
Wow.
He found his father again in debt for $36 and was hired out to work off that debt. He then was hired out to another man to pay off $40 his father owed him. By this point, Rod, his father's debts had been paid off, and the elder Crockett allowed his son to leave the home place if he wanted. And he wanted.
Yeah, I can see that. And again, we need to specify something. When we say $36 or $43 or $40, whatever it is, in 1802, that was big money back in those days. That was not chicken feed, to say the least. Crockett returned to the last man that he had worked for, paying off Dad's debt, and he got a job. He stayed there for 4 years, and while there, he got to know this man who was named John Kennedy, and his family, including his niece, Amy Sumner. Now, Amy was engaged to be married to Kennedy's son, Robert. Yes, folks, this is Tennessee, and yes, marriage between cousins was, and in fact, still allowed by law there. Sorry, Steve. Davy was asked to be a part of the wedding party, which is where he met Margaret Elder, who he proposed to. So Margaret and Davy signed a marriage contract on October 21st, 1805. Alas, it was not to be, though, for Margaret had met another man and became engaged to him and married him instead.
Well, Davy soon met another young lady named Polly Finley and her mother, Jean. Well, the two young folks hit it off quite well, but Mama Finley was not at all happy at the man who was winning her daughter's heart, fearing that Davy Crockett was, beneath her. Okay. He was determined, though, that Polly would be his wife regardless of what Jean thought. Davy rounded up a justice of the peace and a marriage license on August 12, 1806. He then took off for the Finley home with family and friends to swoop his future bride up and take her off. Polly's father would have none of that, though, no eloping for his daughter. He begged Davy to marry her at his house, which Davy agreed to do once Jean apologized for her treatment of him. Well, they married, soon started a family. They moved to Franklin County in 1813, naming his home there Kentuck. Polly died there in 1815, and Crockett married a widow, Elizabeth Patton, later that year to help him care for his young children. And Davy and Elizabeth had a son and 2 daughters together.
Well, in 1813, Davy Crockett answered a call for volunteers to fight in what's known as the Creek War, serving under Colonel John Coffee. During his time there, he served as a scout for his unit, and he also did some hunting in order to feed the men. He left for home in December of 1813. Well, Davy was called up again as a part of the Tennessee militia when General Andrew Jackson, that's right, Old Hickory himself, asked for their support in the War of 1812. Crockett re-enlisted as a sergeant for a 6-month tour of duty, mainly spending his time helping to forage for food for the men. He returned home in December after he found a man to finish out his term of the service.
In 1817, Davy, Elizabeth, and all their children moved to Lawrence County, southwest of Nashville, to establish a new homestead. There he decided to run for political office and became a justice of the peace. At the same time, he was elected lieutenant colonel of the local regiment of the Tennessee militia. He was also running several businesses in the area, which needed his time and effort, so he eventually resigned from that justice of the peace position as well as from the local militia regiment. But the political bug had bitten him. In 1821, he was elected to the Tennessee General Assembly. He spent his time at the Assembly fighting for the rights of impoverished settlers who he felt might be cheated out of their land by Tennessee's system of granting new lands, which was very complicated. He also supported Andrew Jackson's opponent in the governor's race in 1821, starting a long and bitter political feud between the two. And that same year, flooding destroyed several of Crockett's businesses and his farm, putting him deep in debt. His father-in-law came to his aid by deeding 800 acres of land on the Obion River in Carroll County, now Gibson County. Crockett sold most of the land to pay those debts, keeping part on which to build a new home.
Well, in 1823, he ran for the General Assembly from Carroll County against Andrew Jackson's nephew-in-law, and he won. When Governor Jackson ran for the U.S. Senate in 1823, Crockett supported his opponent. Jackson won that race just as he had won the previous race for governor. In 1825, Crockett ran for the U.S. House of Representatives from the Tennessee 12th Congressional District, losing to Adam Rankin Alexander. He ran again in 1827 and beat not only Alexander, but another man who had entered the race. Davy Crockett was well on his way to Washington, D.C. But during his first term in D.C., Davy's political rival, Andrew Jackson, was elected President of the United States.
Now, here's an interesting little side note to this. And we've talked about this before on our podcast. Back during the time that Andrew Jackson was president and Davy Crockett was in Congress, a crazy house painter, I think it was, tried to shoot Jackson. And if you remember, Rod, Jackson was going to have none of it. He actually took his walking stick and he beat the living crap out of this guy.
That's right.
And would have killed him had Davy Crockett, who was there with him at the time, they were all going to a state funeral, not pulled that guy away from Jackson and actually saved his life in time for him to go and be executed.
Wow. You know, that's one of those stories too right there. That just goes to show you how much of a short fuse Andrew Jackson had. It did not take much to rile him up and get him started. Like you said, literally almost beat the guy to death.
Yeah, he had anger issues. Let's put it that way.
Yes, he did. Anger issues.
Well, Crockett was reelected to the House in 1829, again defeating Mr. Alexander. Now, during this term, he introduced legislation to abolish West Point, feeling it was, quote, public money going to benefit the sons of wealthy men. More importantly, though, Crockett opposed the Indian Removal Act and was the only member of the Tennessee delegation to vote against it. Cherokee Chief John Ross sent Crockett a letter thanking him for his vote. That was, though, about the only thanks he got for voting against the act.
His constituents ended up voting him out of office in 1831 because of his opposition to the Indian Removal Act. Well, Davy Crockett ran again for Congress in 1833, and this time he won. He was defeated for re-election, though, in 1835. Quick turnarounds here in Congress, but most of you know that, only 2-year terms. But by the time he had written in collaboration with Kentucky Congressman Thomas Chilton his autobiography, A Narrative of the Life of David Crockett, written by himself. After his defeat, he went east on a promotional tour for the book. In 1836, the newspapers reported him saying,
I told the people of my district that I would serve them as faithfully as I'd done, but if not, they might go to hell, and I'd go to Texas.
And you know what, Steve? Texas is exactly where he went, and we'll tell you that part of the story on our next podcast episode.
How about that? Now, this guy, I mean, he lived a life. I mean, he went from nothing on the frontier to being a congressman, having businesses, having 800 acres of land, all that. And to be honest with you, he was quite a self-promoter. Right. Don't you think he would have loved to have Facebook and Twitter back in his day?
Probably would have, but you know, that's like in the hands of some people, it's a very scary thing. So we're probably glad that they didn't have that sort of thing back then. Even the telegraph wasn't around at that point. So we're at least lucky on that.
Well, folks, thanks for listening. You can subscribe to the Stories Podcast in many ways. At our website, storiespodcast.net, at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, iHeartRadio, Radio Public, Stitcher, or on your favorite podcast app. Again, thanks for listening. Till next we meet. So long, everybody.
So long.